This is JoAnn Russell with part 3 of my 4-part series of interviews with Barbara Steffens, author of Your Sexually Addicted Spouse, How Partners Can Cope and Heal. Welcome back, Barbara.
I'm glad to be back. Thanks so much.
Oh, well, good to have you here again. Barbara, in part 2 of this 4-part interview series, we talked about how we react to the discovery that our partners have a problem with sexual addiction. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the physical and mental effects that the stress and trauma of that discovery have on our bodies and our minds. We spoke a little bit in our last interview about the inherent dishonesty of sex addicts and how damaging this is to the partner. Today let's explore this concept just a little bit farther. Anyone who has discovered that their partner is a sex addict undergoes extreme stress. But how do you define the difference between stress and trauma?
Well, I think to start with, we would say that everyone experiences stress, not everyone experiences trauma, and this is everyone in the general term. And stress has levels or degrees to it. And when we're under stress, we experience this heightened adrenaline. For a lot of people, if they have a great deal of stress in their life, that can lead to anxiety or any number of physical illnesses. Stress is really just a part of life. Some level of stress is good. It keeps us motivated, keeps us moving. But when it reaches a certain level, then the body's ability to handle it and to recover from those spikes of stress, that can cause some long-term problems, both physiologically and emotionally for someone. For some people, when they experience way too much stress, they go into what we call a crisis state, where their ability to cope and manage it breaks down. But stress in general is just part of living. We all experience it. But trauma, when we experience trauma, that's something or a stressor or an event in our lives that is out of the ordinary experience. And trauma brings about that heightened stress response, but also extreme fear, a sense of terror, actually, and a sense of hopelessness and helplessness in this situation. I feel helpless to do anything about the event.
Yes.
Trauma just kind of invades. It invades our sense of safety and our sense of security. So I compare it to like a traumatic physical wound or injury. It puts someone's life at risk and affects every part of that person. And it takes quite a bit of time and attention to heal that wound and to address all the areas of a person's life that the trauma has affected. In relational trauma, it's the person's relational life, relationship, or sometimes actual life that is extremely threatened. In relational trauma, our well-being is shattered, our just sense of being well and safe in the world. So that's trauma.
Yes. Now, is it common to see physical symptoms when someone is experiencing stress or trauma?
Yeah, very, very common. A lot of times our body will tell us we're under stress way before we emotionally or cognitively are aware of that. So if there's chronic or ongoing stress, a lot of times we see that contributes to physical illness. Trauma survivors are under a lot of extreme stress, and so they can be at an even greater risk. One really good author that we found as we were putting together the book that talks about the physical aspect of trauma is Peter Levine. So I would refer people to his books. The one that I'm aware of is called Waking the Tiger.
I have that book.
Yeah, good book.
I thought it was excellent. It's a little bit heavy to read, but I thought it was excellent.
There's another one that I have not read, but I've heard is wonderful. It's called The Body Remembers. Again, it just talks about the physiological impact from ongoing stress or trauma and how the wound is just carried in our bodies.
Right, and that helps us to understand what we're going through.
Absolutely.
Can you describe for our listeners exactly what post-traumatic stress disorder is? I know I'm a little confused on it.
Okay, well, it's a recognized mental health condition. let's see, how can I do this pretty quickly? There's a big manual of all different kinds of diagnoses that the American Psychiatric Association puts together, and post-traumatic stress disorder is found in that big manual. And so it has very specific description of the disorder and description of the kinds of symptoms or criteria for someone to have that diagnosis. It's considered an anxiety disorder, and it requires that the person had experienced a traumatic event where the person experienced or witnessed a life-threatening situation or death. They witnessed the death of someone. And at the same time that they experienced a sense of helplessness and terror in the situation.
Yes. Okay, so what are the symptoms of PTSD?
Well, there's three major symptom groups, and this is the current diagnostic criteria. They're working on a new DSM, which is that big diagnostic manual, and so we're unclear what it's going to look like when that book comes out. But currently, it's three major symptom groups. Persistent re-experiencing of the event, that's one of them. Persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma, that's the second one. And then persistent symptoms of increased arousal. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. And along with those three symptoms or categories of symptoms, the symptoms have to last more than 4 weeks or a month and after the traumatic event. And it significantly impacts important areas of functioning. So that would be like in your ability to work, social relationships, things like that. So the common symptoms would include things like flashbacks. That's where all of a sudden it's like you were in that moment, that traumatic moment again, and it's very vivid and real. Intrusive thoughts or memories, you're not planning on it, but all of a sudden reminders, memories, pictures flood your mind.
Yes.
Avoidance of reminders, that's where people will avoid certain activities, parts of town, conversations, sexual activity, things that bring about reminders. So they try to avoid it to avoid the anxiety. They'll experience mood swings. A lot of my clients call this the roller coaster. They can be fine one moment and in a pit of despair the next, and angrier than they've ever been in the next 5 minutes. And it can really just kind of fly all over the place. And that's where people feel crazy, because they feel like they're totally out of control of their mood swings.
Yes.
They also experience mental confusion. It can be very hard to concentrate. Hypervigilance, that's that feeling on edge at all time, really high startle reflex, looking for and scanning the environment for risks, for threats all the time. And then, of course, really high anxiety. There's also with that bouts of depressed mood.
Yes.
That go along with that. More than just sadness, just real depth of depression.
And I think we've all gone through that. Anyone involved with a sex addict has all those symptoms.
And there's various degrees of those, and they can change over time in terms of their intensity. One of the surprises for people is that early on, maybe right after disclosure, they may find that they're coping pretty well. And then after maybe a month, 6 weeks or something, that's when the symptoms really start to hit them.
Yes.
And I think a lot of that is because early on we're in survival mode.
Absolutely. That's how I felt. I just felt numb.
Yeah, numb in survival mode, and then as things really start to kick in and reality starts to kick in, that's when a lot of the more troublesome symptoms for some people start to kick in.
And I've seen that so many times on the people who write into the site. It's very fresh. They've just found out within a few days, and they sound amazingly calm. And it's just like any other trauma victim, a rape victim.
Right.
You're just totally calm. It hasn't hit you yet.
Yeah, and that's that wonderful coping mechanism that we're born with called denial.
Yes.
And it serves a function. We don't want to stay there forever, but initially it really serves a function to help us get through the things we need to do.
It certainly does. So what is the usual course of treatment for PTSD?
Well, there's various models of treatment for PTSD. I would never consider myself a specialist on post-traumatic stress disorder, although I'm becoming one. But the typical course involves what I've understood as 4 stages. The first is that crisis stabilization. That's where we're working with a partner to establish some sense of safety, maybe setting some early boundaries, doing some good self-care, just dealing with that initial crisis. And then the second is the cognitive stage, and that's where you're remembering, thinking about, looking at the details of the trauma. And then the third is feeling the feelings. And that's where a person is really focused on grieving losses, acknowledging anger, and all those really distressful emotions that come after a trauma. And then hopefully moving on into empowerment. And that's where they're really taking good action for themselves and then finding meaning and a new identity through the trauma, finding new strengths they didn't know they had,
Yes.
Finding how this is going to be used in their life, in their future, that it's not an end to their life, but it starts to become integrated into the story of their life.
Yes.
So the first stage is about getting your feet under you and taking stock of what you need to feel safe. And once a sense of increased safety is established, then you move on into recovery. And that first stage for a lot of partners kind of lasts a long time. They go from crisis stage to crisis stage.
Yes.
And I think a lot of that is because of the repeated disclosures that they get. They just start to come down off that crisis. They think they kind of have their feet under them, and then they find out some more information. And then that re-traumatization occurs, and they go back into crisis.
Yeah, that's such a horrible feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So, Barbara, I'm trying to understand this. Is it correct to say that your trauma model for treating partners of sex addicts is based upon a clinical model for treating patients with PTSD?
Yes, it is. Although I have found that not all partners develop full-blown PTSD. Most have at least some level of trauma symptomology. Again, there's a lot of different models out there, but ours follows a pretty traditional cognitive behavioral model of treatment. Cognitive behavioral would be that a traumatic event affects how we see, interpret, believe the world to be, and then that affects our behaviors and our emotions. Now you can find a pretty good summary of what that journey looks like, that process looks like in the book. I think it's on page 109. Marcia Means did a great job of taking what we talked about in terms of our treatment model and put it into a grid or a process so people can see a map. We always like to have maps for our journey.
Yes.
So Marcia did a great job of pointing that out.
Yes, she did. I love that
Mm-hmm.
grid.
Yeah.
I'm very visual, so putting it all in place made it really so much more understandable.
Yeah, I think she did a great job on that. But that's it. It's pretty much cognitive behavioral. We do some maybe psychodynamic where you're kind of looking at inner processes, but most of it's crisis intervention and then cognitive behavioral.
That's great. Many partners of sex addicts have physical, emotional, or financial circumstances that prevent them from leaving an unhealthy relationship with a sex addict. In your book, you describe these situations as disempowering, which puts the partner at risk for developing the PTSD. So can you tell our listeners how a partner in this type of situation where they're staying with the sex addict and he's or she is probably still acting out, how can they prevent the stress and trauma from becoming PTSD?
Okay, well, we don't always know if taking a certain action will prevent PTSD, but we do know things that can help. There's been a lot of research that's been done on what are some factors that, if they're present, help prevent PTSD. And the main thing that people have found in their research is having support is the best preventive measure. So that's having caring, empathic people around that validates the person's experience and feelings and perceptions. Now, if she is or he is still with an acting out addict, that person is not going to be able to help the partner feel safe and validated.
Right.
So that's where the partner really needs support groups, support networks, healthy people that can speak reality into their lives. So we do know that isolation contributes to the development of PTSD. So the very first step when I talk to a partner is who knows about this and who can you tell so that you can find some support.
Yes.
Then the next step is establishing safety. If she can't leave or doesn't want to, and there's a lot of good reasons why that might be very, very difficult, then we work on how we can help the partner develop some safe space in the relationship. So that can involve a lot of different kinds of things, including sleeping separately, maybe even having a physical separation within the same home where you just have different parts of the house. If she can't do that, then it may be how to limit some of the really destructive conversations that can occur, the blaming, the arguing, fighting. So a lot of boundary work to help her feel more empowered around the options that she does have. I find that most of the partners I've worked with who continue to, or they're living with someone who's continuing to act out, it really is an emotionally abusive relationship. So I work with her like I would with anyone who's in that kind of domestic violent or emotionally abusive relationship. We want to try and find some safety, some ways of being safe. Developing a safety plan. If it really gets too uncomfortable, too heated, where can you go and what would you do?
Sure.
And how can you plan for that event?
Right.
So we want to give her strategy so she has some options. There's nothing worse than feeling helpless. So
Yes.
we want to find places where she can exercise some level of control in her life.
Now, is it possible to treat the PTSD if the partner remains in the relationship where she feels unsafe and powerless?
Well, I think it is possible to treat it, but it is difficult. Again, I try to work with the person to find at least some small ways to establish safety. It's really hard to heal if the wound continues. You think about you have a wound on your skin and it starts to heal up, and then all of a sudden the scab gets ripped off. And so
Yes.
you have this wound that festers and has a hard time healing. So we really do work with partners to help them detach from the addict as much as possible if the wounding continues. And for a lot of women, because they've lived in not only this situation with a sexual addict who's been acting out, along with that comes that emotional environment where over time her ability to trust her own perceptions, judgment, decision-making, power, that's been eroded. So it can take a while to build that up so that she's strong enough to take some action.
Yes. Barbara, your groundbreaking trauma model for treating partners of sex addicts is counter to the more commonly used methods of treatment. So how does one go about finding a counselor who will put your ideas into practice?
Well, that's another great question. It is really hard. I get emails almost every day asking for a therapist who does what you do in my area of the country or of the world, actually. So there are some therapists who are trained in sex addiction who now understand this model and are incorporating it, and we're finding that that's increasing. But right now, personally, I only know of a handful. I'm sure there's a lot more. And the good news is that I do know it's increasing because now part of the training for the Certified Sexual Addiction Therapists, or we call them CSATs. Part of their training now is they have to read my research article. So
Isn't
that they're
that
getting,
fantastic?
I know, it was great. So they're
Wow.
at least reading the concept and getting the information out that, finding out that you're living with a sex addict, it might be traumatic for this partner. So pay attention to the trauma first before you go into their co-addict model. So at least that is starting to happen. But that's only with the new CSATs, the ones that are going through training now. Some of the others, unless they have come to workshops, read the book, read the article, it still probably is, sifting through their training.
Yes.
Therapists who do not have training in sex addiction probably are more open to the model than some of the sex addiction therapists, just because they understand relational trauma. If you can't find a sex addiction therapist who understands trauma in the partner, then I would suggest someone look for a therapist who has training and experience in working in other areas of relational trauma. So you look for someone who has experience working with domestic violence or emotional abuse. Maybe give your therapist a copy of the book, ask them to read it if it really is helpful and communicates the partner's experience. I always recommend that you leave if the therapist refuses to hear your point of view, if they're rigid, if they don't treat you as an individual. There's lots of therapists out there. Unfortunately, sometimes you have to therapist shop, but finding the right one makes all the difference.
It certainly does. I went through 3 therapists, all women, and finally found one who seemed to really hear what I was saying.
Yeah.
And I think that's vital. And so many people who don't have a lot of self-confidence feel uncomfortable saying, this isn't quite working and I need to find someone else.
Right. Now, it's part of that empowerment process to say, I have needs and I need someone who can be with me as I'm trying to heal. I need someone to hear my experience, to validate my perceptions, to help me find my way, and not someone who's just going to put a model on me and then try to force me into what they think that model should look like.
Exactly. Well, Barbara, once again, we're out of time. I really want to thank you for taking the time from your very busy schedule to share your ideas with us. Barbara will join us again next week, and we will talk about how partners of sex addicts can heal from the trauma and stress of discovery and go forward with a positive purpose. Until then, this is JoAnn Russell at marriedtoasexaddict.com, reminding everyone that you are not alone. Come visit the site soon and often and share your stories and comments on this very complex issue of sexual addiction. Until the next time we meet, take care and be safe.